What's up, everybody? Franco here with Frank Analysis. I'm back here again to talk about Cuba, this time with my friend Ramiro Sebastian Funez. He's a Honduran communist and a content creator with his own channel named after himself. I'll have that linked in the description for you guys to follow him. He does amazing work, and he's also a documentary filmmaker. One of the documentaries that you guys should definitely check out is one on Nicaragua, right? So I want to introduce Ramiro here to everybody. And Ramiro, you can also let everybody know a bit about some of the work that you do.
No doubt. Thanks again for having me, Franco. It's really an honor, always an honor being on your channel. I think that your channel's one of the best ones out there on the independent left that has a variety of
Oh,
views. And it's cool talking to you, man, especially about Cuba, because there's so much disinformation out there, which we'll get into. But in terms of some of the content that I create a lot of anti-imperialist content. I have a stream called Unmasking Imperialism, where we break down imperialist propaganda piece by piece. We just did an episode about Cuba a few days ago. We also have one on the DPRK, aka North Korea, and other stuff. And then I also have the documentary you mentioned, Nicaragua Against Empire. I'm actually going to Nicaragua tonight with my girlfriend Ophelia. We're going to fly out later tonight for the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua, another nation resisting U.S. imperialism. So I'm hoping to get some more content of that. And yeah, check out my channel, Ramiro Sebastian Funez. And again, man, it's a pleasure talking to you.
it's a pleasure having you on, man. So I love having you and Caleb on to talk about these issues and getting your perspective from from a socialist background. So this is a continuation from what I was talking about 2 days ago, as well as what I discussed with Nico on his channel about what's happening in Cuba and how the U.S. is saying that people are protesting against their government because of the way that they treated the COVID situation. But what is not mentioned is the way that the blockade has really influenced the situation in Cuba all these decades. So I'm going to share with you guys again as a reminder how there's 184 countries that are in favor of removing the blockade against Cuba. And once again, the ones that are against this is the United States and Israel. And there's also that abstained: Colombia, Ukraine, and Brazil, all of which are under a neoliberal regime. In the case of Colombia and Brazil, it's a far right regime. With Ukraine, there's neo Nazis there in that country. So, Ramiro, you want to talk a little bit about that blockade in Cuba? Why do you think this is not talked about enough in the U.S.?
Yeah, most definitely. And it's interesting. That's an interesting infographic that you point out. First of all, before getting into some of the history of the blockade, if we look at the countries, right, the U.S. and Israel are in favor of the blockade. Obviously, Israel being a settler colonial project in the Middle East, displacing the Palestinian indigenous peoples of the region. You also have three countries that have reactionary right wing governments, like you mentioned. You have Brazil, run by Bolsonaro, who's a hardcore Zionist who loves Israel, loves the Christian far right. In Colombia, Ivan Duque, another Zionist far right, the Israel of Latin America,
Mm.
overseeing the systematic repression of Black and Indigenous people. And then you also have Ukraine, also a Zionist government run by pro EU, pro Israel government that is killing ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, and in the Crimean region. And it's just interesting because that's sort of the common uniting thread between all those countries is that you have U.S., Israel, Colombia, Ivan Duque run by a Zionist president, Brazil, Bolsonaro run by a Zionist president, and Ukraine run by a Zionist government with very close ties to the fascist far right. And what's the underlying theme? The underlying theme is superiority complex, racism, chauvinism against oppressed nationalities, marginalized peoples. And that's important to keep in mind for context because these nations are at the forefront of empire. And in terms of the actual blockade, one thing we have to be clear is that a lot of people have been using the word embargo, but it's really a blockade. And this goes back to October 19th, 1960, almost 2 years after the Cuban Revolution, that the U.S. placed the blockade on Cuba. And this was after the Cuban Revolution, after the 1959 Cuban Revolution, when Fidel Castro and the revolutionaries in Cuba liberated the country from the yoke of colonialism, of imperialism, from U.S. empire. And keep in mind the fact that like this, Cuba was one of the last countries in Latin America and the Caribbean to become independent from empires. It's a very different story from, let's say, our countries. You know, your family's from Peru, which got quote unquote independence in the early 1800s. Honduras, same as well in the early 1820s. Cuba, remember, was under Spanish dominion up until 1898, right? That was a very, very long time. Spanish American War, eventually it became just another neo-colony of the US. So the 1959 Cuban Revolution was really an independence movement, an independence war against imperialism. And that's an important context to keep in mind, right? Because right after the 1959 Cuban Revolution and Cuba freed itself from Spanish and US imperialism and colonialism, this blockade was imposed that continues to reverberate today and impact the Cuban people today. There are estimates that the blockade has held back the country, has cost billions and billions of dollars worth of funds for the Cuban government. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, because when we're talking about a blockade, like we don't really, and sanctions as well, when we hear the terms, we don't really think much about it. But what essentially it is it prevents you from trading with other companies, trading with other countries, getting the wealth and resources you need to survive. So it would, the example I like to use to bring it to a microcosm level is, let's say that the US decides that you, Franco, they don't like you, they don't like your views, they don't like your YouTube channel. They're like, this guy's spouting too much anti-government, quote unquote, propaganda. And so anyone who trades with you, anyone who gives you a job, they can go to jail. So anybody you work for, they can go to jail for hiring you, for paying you. Any bank that allows you to save money in can also face criminal charges because they're financing terrorism. Any hospital that tries to treat your wounds can get legal charges because they're helping terrorism. Anyone who even talks to you can face legal charges because they're aiding and abetting terrorism. So it's like a scarlet letter. It's a blacklist. A blockade completely hinders you from everyday normal life, and that is what Cuba has been dealing with for the past 50 plus years since the blockade. And that context is so important to know, because even though Cuba has been financially strangled and attacked for so long, for decades, not only have they managed to feed, house, clothe, and bring healthcare to their people, but they've been able to send doctors around the world. They've been able to help liberate African countries from European colonialism for decades. So just to kind of wrap that point up about the blockade, is it's a huge stranglehold on Cuba's economy. It has been for the past 50 years. Cuba has learned to evolve and grow based on the changes and the changing circumstances. But it's something that we have to understand. It's not like people have this idea that once you have a socialist revolution, it's instant utopia. You have a magic wand and you could do whatever you want. If you want skyscrapers, all you got to do is say the magic words and you get them. No, it's not like that at all. You know, you have to struggle. You have to compete in the global economy. You have to survive. And Cuba has been able to do that despite the blockade. So framing the conversation around the blockade is so important whenever we're talking about Cuba.
One thing I see shared around from some of my family members who are unfortunately buying into this, but also a lot of people who are buying into this propaganda, is showing pictures of the hospitals in Cuba and how they look. Like they're like, oh, look how dirty the hospitals are. There's cockroaches coming out of the sink. Look at how dirty the floors are and everything. Look at their tech, like the tech that they use there in their hospitals. The tools, they're outdated. And I'm like, yeah, that's because of the blockade. So if you're going to be sharing that, then why don't you also support removing these blockades that are preventing Cuba from having better equipment and all that? Like they were able to succeed in having all these great doctors, right? So have you also been seeing that shared around? And do you want to debunk some of these myths that people share about how, oh, this is because of, the Cuban government.
That's a great point. And this is where it's so important for me as a Marxist, as a dialectical materialist, to share the Marxist worldview of reality, of how we understand the universe. One of the key principles of Marxism is the difference between appearance and essence. Things appear a certain way in reality. We can see things, right? We have all these idiots on social media posting pictures of broken down buildings and hospitals and stuff in Cuba, which we're not denying reality, right? We're not saying that that those pictures are fake, that they don't exist. Of course, and the Cuban people are the first to say, yes, these there are problems, there are lack of resources because of the blockade going on here. What you appear to see is true, but what is the essence of what we're seeing? Why is it the way it is? Right? There's what we see and why it is that way, and that's where the Marxist worldview. We have to take a closer look at to why that's happening. And one of the things that Marx talks about is that under capitalism, the capitalists create so much propaganda that they keep people in a world of appearances. They can only interpret based on what they see, but we don't know the backstory to it, right? We don't know why it is the way it is. It's like when we meet a human being and we meet somebody who, like, we see a kid in school, for example. Like, if you're a teacher and you see a kid in school who comes into school every day, his clothes are dirty, he looks sad, he looks not happy, he's not doing well in school. In appearance, it seems like all these problems are inherent to him. It's the kid's fault. But then when we really take a closer examination, investigation into his situation, maybe his parents are abusing him, maybe his siblings are abusing him. In this case, the US would be the abuser. Cuba has been abused. The appearance is a bruised and beat up Cuba, which is true. But the essence is the abuse of US imperialism, of those decades of blockade, of sanctions, of coup attempts, of assassination attempts for decades and decades since the Cuban Revolution. That's the essence, that's the backstory that mainstream media is not giving us. And that's why it's so important for us to really study the history of Cuba in order to understand the essence of why is it that there's scarcity. And we can't make value judgments based on only what we see. Like, I think that's such a superficial analysis, because anyone can go, like, that's one of the common things you hear, right? They're like, oh, look, Cuba, there's these old buildings, they're so dusty, there's
Yeah.
these old cars, they're not advanced. But the mindset they're using to, like, understand that is very superficial, because you can easily go to New York. I'm from New York, man. Like, I'm born and raised in New York. Just a few weeks ago, not even a few days ago, there was huge rainstorms in New York. The whole subway system got flooded. There was literally families, people jumping over puddles, trains stuck in the middle of the tunnels, have people having to walk out of the tunnels over puddles of rainwater because they couldn't have enough public funds to support the subway system because of capitalist climate change. Go to LA, where I'm at right now. I live in LA right now. There's a place called Skid Row, where there's hundreds and hundreds and thousands of unhoused people who live there. And 2 blocks away are these huge skyscrapers, celebrities munching on granola and avocado toast. And then you have homeless people chilling on the sidewalk. So it's just a complete double standard, because you can apply that same logic to capitalist countries, and it's a million times worse, because Cuba has nowhere near the level of homelessness, of child beggars, of anything like that compared to the capitalist countries. So we have to be careful, and in Marxism we call that the process of abstraction, right? It's kind of like a camera. Like, if we have a camera, we can zero in on certain things, snap a photo, freeze it in time, and create value judgments based on that abstraction. We have to be careful about which abstractions we allow the capitalists to feed us, because the capitalist media is just giving us these isolated, fragmented abstractions of Cuban reality, and not showing any of the good, not showing the decades of blockades, of repression, not showing the successes of the Cuban people. They're just like, oh, look, there's this building that hasn't been painted in a few years. Socialism fails. So again, it just goes back to how we understand reality. We have to move past the realm of appearances and move in a more essence-based, Marxist scientific-based understanding of reality.
Very well said. Yeah. Like yo, you're saying like, where? How come these pictures of homeless people in the U.S. aren't being distributed? All these 10 cities in L.A., 10 cities under bridges in D.C., people eating out of the trash in D.C. All these people that don't have clean water in parts of the U.S. Like they're not showing that, and they don't show what the U.S. does in other countries, like what we see here. This is by Kavark Almasian. What he shared on Twitter said, "Look, this is what happens after the U.S. intervenes in countries in the Middle East. We have Iraq. Look at how beautiful the city was. Libya, Yemen, Syria, and then." Like this is how they manufacture our consent. They say, "Oh, there's like a dictator over there. There's people rising up, and then they're only showing like one side, some of which like people have like U.S. flags and stuff, and then we find out later that the U.S. like was involved in some way, paying these people, and then we have assholes like this guy, the mayor of
Mm.
Miami, saying bomb Cuba an option that needs to be discussed. Like this is how they start implanting these ideas in people's heads to manufacture consent for intervention, like physical intervention, like what we saw in those pictures of what happened in the Middle East. Miami Mayor Francis Suarez said the U.S. should consider bombing Cuba as part of its response to recent citizen uprising against the country's government, right? Because we want to help the citizens so much that we want to bomb them. It's absolutely ridiculous. In a Tuesday interview with Fox News, Suarez noted a brief history of U.S. involvement in overturning foreign leaders. His history mentioned the U.S. airstrikes in Kosovo during its 1999 humanitarian crisis. Are you suggesting airstrikes in Cuba? Fox News Martha McCollum asked Suarez, what I'm suggesting is that that option is one that has to be explored and cannot be just simply discarded as an option that is not on the table," Suarez answered. And there's a
Wow.
variety of ways the military can do it, but that's something that needs to be discussed and needs to be looked at as a potential option in addition to a variety of other options that can be discussed. Thousands of Cubans are protesting their government as the coronavirus pandemic has contributed to food shortages and the worst economic crisis the country has had in 30 years. The Cuban government has blamed U.S. sanctions for its food shortages. However, the problem has been worsened by the lack of tourism during the pandemic as well as by government economic policy, according to The Economist. So, Ramiro, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, first, I just want to point out like, the wordsmithing on that article, the Cuban government has blamed, right? So for anybody
Right.
who's just scrolling, like reading that, it's crazy, right? It would be like, what would be a good analogy? It would be like somebody fucking me up in the middle of the street, like beating me down, and and then me trying to go to work but not being able to go to work, and then some journalist being like, Ramiro has blamed that guy who beat the crap out of him for not being able to go to work, but it's just like,
Like,
duh, like, yeah, he just beat the
yeah,
crap out of me.
accurately, yeah.
Right. Again, right, like that's the thing about media and wordsmithing and media. Again, this is why that Malcolm X quote, man, it's so relevant and important. The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They will make you think your friends are your enemies and your enemies are your friends. This is so relevant to Cuba because it's doing exactly that by framing things a certain way, by making it seem like Cuba is the enemy and they're the ones that are blaming people. It's just, again, part of the techniques of propaganda that people unfortunately fall for over and over and over. It's like a spell that people fall for. But in terms of this idiot Francis Suarez talking about invading and bombing Cuba, we also have to look at it from the capitalist point of view, right? Because all of this comes down to money and capitalism. What the US imperialist capitalists want is to expand what is Miami, what has become the epicenter of capitalist, imperialist, libertarian, free market, casino capitalism, high tech, Bitcoin, all this stuff of like condos, luxury models, all this stuff, media, porn, everything that we associate with capitalism. They want to expand that into Miami, which is just 90 miles, Cuba, which is just 90 miles away. As we know, Miami is literally sinking as we speak. So even though the capitalists, the U.S. empire, created this mess that is creating to the sinking of their own mecca, their own epicenter of capitalism, of gusanos and the right wing Latin American community. They want to expand that system into Cuba, very close by, where they can make it into a free market libertarian paradise, how it was under Batista in the 50s, exploit workers, bring in the big hedge funds like they're doing in Puerto Rico right now. That's what Puerto Rico has become, a tax haven, a tech paradise for the millionaires. They want to implement that same model in Cuba. Can you imagine how much? And Cuba is the largest island in the Caribbean. So how much wealth, resources, geography, they're salivating over the idea of overthrowing the Cuban government, privatizing everything, making the tech millionaires and billionaires invade the island, kicking the Cubans off. And that is what the Israeli government is doing against the Palestinians. That is what the Brazilian government is doing against Afro-Brazilians on the coast, et cetera, et cetera. So it's part of this mindset of capitalism, imperialism at its highest stage of parasitism, of crisis, of collapse. And in terms of bombing, I mean, this is nothing new. Like people, the gusanos, the right wing, the U.S. has been doing these sort of thing for ever since the Cuban Revolution began. We have to keep in mind, looking back at history, two key events. One of them is April 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the failed landing operation in Cuba with Cuban exiles armed and trained by the U.S. Eisenhower allocated $13.1 million to the CIA to train these right-wing fascists to invade Cuba. And they were unsuccessful. They ultimately failed because of the resistance of the Cuban people. But you're talking about 1,400 Cuban paramilitaries, 5 infantry battalions who were dispatched from Guatemala and Nicaragua, which were run by U.S. puppet states in 1961 at the time. The CIA supplied 8 B-26 bombers, right, bomber planes that attacked Cuban airfields. So they already did that, right, in 1961. The other major event to keep in mind is 1962, Operation Northwoods, proposed false flag operation against U.S. citizens. This is where it gets crazy. That basically started as a plan within the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S. It called for the CIA and the U.S. government arming and training people disguised as Cubans and the Cuban government to commit acts of terrorism against U.S. military and civilian targets, and then blame it on the Cuban government and use it as a excuse to justify a war against Cuba. And this is where this idea, this concept of false flag attacks comes from, where back in the day, what they would do during the Spanish Armada, especially during the war between the Spanish and the English, when the ships would fight each other, is that the British would get close to the Spanish ships, but they would have Spanish flags on their boats to make it seem like they were on the same team, right? And then once they got close enough, they put up the English flag and attacked them. Or conversely, the English would attack the Portuguese and rock Spanish flags, and so the Portuguese would get mad at the Spanish and then blame it on and not the English. And so that's where this idea of the false flag attack comes from, which every liberal is going to be like, oh my God, that's some conspiracy theory. But like, this is documented evidence. Operation Northwoods, look it up, 1962 March, that the U.S. was planning to arm and train terrorists disguised as Cuban agents, disguised as Cuban government people, to kill, to shoot down an airplane, to shoot down. And there's also this crazy lunatic, Luis Posada Carriles, who actually bombed the Cuban airplane, a right-winger who has a monument to him in Miami where all these idiots are protesting, a monument to a terrorist who blew up innocent people, killed innocent people on a Cuban airline, Cubana airline. And so this is things that they've been doing. They created this. They created this idea of bombing and then blaming it on the people they're attacking. So it's some real dark, sinister, evil shit. And again, so important for people to go back into history, read this stuff. It's literally like people are like, oh yeah, what's your source? I'm like CIA.gov. Like they fucking tell you right there, you know? So it's crazy, man. But yeah, those are the two events historically I think people should look into as this Miami mayor is talking about bombing Cuba, is the Bay of Pigs, 1961, and Operation Northwoods, 1962.
Exactly. And that's the norm. Like, just go through all these CIA documents and look at what they do, not just to Cuba, but all these other Latin American countries, the Middle East, Africa, all countries like in the global South. And then to add on to what you were saying, Ramiro, look at this: CIA considered bombing Miami and killing refugees, blamed Castro. This is back in October 27, 2017, when this was written. Donald Trump's bold promises earlier this week to finally blow the lid off the JFK assassination mystery by declassifying reams of secret documents turned out to be a gigantic tease. The National Archives ended up making public only a fraction of the JFK documents last night. Still, the 2,800 papers included in the new document dump confirm some salacious details of America's decade-long quest to kill or oppose Fidel Castro, including a fairly shocking plan by the CIA to sow terror in Miami. After Castro's revolution succeeded and thousands of Cubans fled to South Florida, the agency actually considered murdering a boatload of refugees, assassinating exiled leaders, and planting bombs in Miami. So Castro could be blamed for the chaos. The basic idea was to turn world opinion against Castro and possibly justify U.S. military invasion by pinning the atrocities on him. The details of the sinister plot are included in a summary about Operation Mongoose, a 1960 covert op hatched by the CIA under President Dwight Eisenhower with the aim of toppling communist Cuba. And then there's also the assassination attempts when they even try to assassinate him with like cigar bombs. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous the lengths that the U.S. has tried to go to get rid of this leader. So, do you have any comments about that?
Wow, it's crazy. Not surprising. The fuckery on the part of the US government, as always, is insane. But here's the thing, like, even though it's so out in the open, if you bring that up to so many people, especially so many liberals or right wingers who love quote unquote America, they're like, "Oh my God, you're crazy! You're making this up," and it's all there. It's all publicly
Mm-hmm.
available knowledge, and it just shows that there is no loyalty among thieves. People like the U.S. government would kill their own, would kill the right wing Cuban gusanos in Miami just to get them to use them, scapegoat them for war, for imperialism, and it reminds me a lot of what the U.S. has tried to do against Assad with the so-called chemical weapons attacks, with the so-called, and then you have the role of people on the quote unquote left. I don't know if you saw that debate with Hinkle and Vosh, but
Yeah.
on Syria, but it's relevant because Vosh
Mm-hmm.
represented. I don't even. I mean, at this point, I think he's like a straight up Fed, but whatever. That's a whole different discussion.
Yeah.
But for somebody like him, like to be the voice of the left, and then say like, I condemn these crimes by Assad. His role and the role of the synthetic left, the pro-imperialist left in this whole regime change operation is to turn to rebrand imperialism as a humanitarian face, to be like, we need to go in there and save innocent people
Yeah.
because this brutal dictator is killing people. And that's what we see literally happening with all these other what is this guy Bad Empanada, all these other people who are
Yeah.
who are saying stuff like, we need to SOS Cuba, we need to go in there and save people, because again the strategy has changed over and over and over again. That's one of the things that we have to, on the left, we have to study the imperialists and the capitalists, because they constantly innovate, right? The same methods that they apply to free market capitalism of innovation and changing, they apply to imperialist regime change. They have changed the face of Gusano right wing terrorism of Cubans so many times, right? I think that the Miami right wing, white, wealthy, Gusano type imperialism regime change against Cuba has lost its appearance, has lost its popularity, because at this point, so many people have been awoken and are so obvious to the fact that a lot of the Gusanos in Miami were the descendants of slave owners and the wealthy elites who ran Cuba like a casino and a personal hacienda in the 1950s. And so that branding is over. Now we're in the era of woke imperialism, of intersectional empire, where you have the CIA, the NED, the USAID funding groups like Gente de Zona, which are Afro Cubans, the San Isidro movement, which a hip hop group. They're like, we got to be cool with our imperialist regime change. So now we're going to fund black and brown people and hip hop groups to make it seem like there's this authentic grassroots uprising against the real revolutionary government of Cuba in this process known as astroturfing, creating a fake grassroots movement where a grassroots movement doesn't genuinely exist, like astroturf, like fake grass. And that's exactly what they're doing in Cuba now. That's why it's so important. That's why a lot of the synthetic left pro-imperialist people get so mad when we point this out, because we're literally we're spilling their secret, which is the U.S. empire is now attacking the left from the left. They're now rebranding themselves with this woke imperialism. That's why instead of before in the 60s, right, the slogans were like death to communism, long live capitalism. It was like more right wing, more just outwardly fascist and pro capitalist. Now it's SOS Cuba, Cuban uprising, Cuban protest, Black Lives Matter in Cuba, because they know that old technique no longer works. They need this new woke intersectional method of imperialism, and that's exactly what they're doing today.
Exactly. And then they shame you. Like they try to call us right wingers when we're the ones that are standing against empire. No, the position of being against empire is the left wing position. They're like, oh, you're a fascist, or they say you're a literal neo-Nazi, or a literal genocide denier. I mean, the evidence is right there, man. What are you talking about? And you're just buying into what the mainstream media says. You're not even questioning it. What kind of critical thinker are you? But that's just how they are, and then that discussion of whether they're feds or not, we can say that for another day, but they're definitely serving the empire.
Oh, yeah, they are.
So I wanted to share this just to show people how long this has been going on. It's been going on further than 1973, which is what you see in the title here. Make the Economy Scream. Secret documents show Nixon, Kissinger role back in 1973 Chile coup. This decades, the U.S. empire has been trying to destabilize countries that are potentially going to surpass them, and with their economy, like having these socialist programs. Chile was on the verge of being competitors to European countries and the U.S., but they can't have that. So then the Ford Foundation and other corporations started funding for Pinochet and his regime, which was a absolutely like a crisis. What happened when he took over, and how many innocent people were killed when he took office. So yeah, this article that I can share with you guys by Democracy Now. This is like an old one. Their work now is a little disappointing, but regardless, this is a good history lesson for you guys if you want to read up on this, on what the role that happened in the 1970s under the Nixon administration with Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State, in trying to destabilize all these countries from Chile to Indonesia. So yeah, Ramiro, you want to talk a little bit about that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. Henry Kissinger is somebody who is an evil genius, somebody straight out of a bad horror movie, an evil genius who understands that in order to overthrow countries that are unfavorable to your government, in order to impose capitalism and imperialism abroad on peoples around the world, you have to change your strategy. You have to dominate the media. You have to be able to ruin an economy, completely devastate an economy, and bring it to shambles in order to build popular support. There are two ways to make people take certain action. You can scare the crap out of them, right? With fear. Fear is one of the best ways to control people, right? So that's what they're doing to Cubans on the island with the imperialist propaganda apparatus. They're saying, if you continue to stay in Cuba, you're going to get killed. You're going to be another China or Soviet Union. So they're the right wing with their media apparatus, with the fake social media, Twitter, and all that. They're sending messages of fear to people in Cuba who not even are necessarily bad people or even right wingers, but they're just getting their adrenaline up. They're making them feel anxious, like I need to do something, right? The other way to control people is compassion, and that's a more interesting one because that's a feeling that's targeted more at people outside of Cuba, to the quote unquote left, who's like, we need to go in and do something, we need to help, because we have that element within us as humans of compassion, of empathy. We want to help other people. And so when we see people buying into a fear campaign and fearing for their lives, we naturally have a sense of compassion and want to help them out. So Kissinger is one of these types who, Kissinger was somebody who studied Freud very closely. He studied
Mm.
psychoanalysis very closely. He learned from some of the biggest families. And I know people are gonna maybe cringe when I say this name, but the Rothschild family that he studied very carefully, Kissinger, studied the Napoleonic Wars, 1810, how the Rothschild family manipulated England and France and used the media to make it seem like both sides lost, when in reality, one side won, and that family emerged victorious in terms of finances. And so understanding psychology and also using the economy, destroying an economy, is the best way to topple and overthrow a government. And it's one of those interesting things because Kissinger understood that in order to destabilize a country's economy, not only do you have to completely cut it off, you have to completely make it impossible for that country to trade with other people and other nations like they did with Chile from 1970 to 1973. But they also have to blame whatever problems that are created in the country because of imperialist encirclement on the socialist model or whatever model is being implemented in that country, so that people will equate whatever failures there are with that idea that somebody has of socialism or anti-imperialism. So the psychological analysis role is so important in understanding economics, because within human history, we have a trajectory, the three stages of revolution. First, there's an economic revolution, changes in the economy. And so if it's a good or a bad change, for example, sanctions, if this all this blockades being imposed on Cuba and Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other countries, you have a negative impact on the economy. The price of goods goes up, inflation, right? You have brain drain. You have purposeful economic collapse created by the imperialists. So once that economic change is made, then there's a social change where in society people begin to point out those problems from both the left and the right. People who are loyal anti-imperialists and who understand will say, look, these problems are created because of capitalism, because of imperialism. We need to change. And that's what China did in 1978, 1979 with reform and opening up, because that same strategy was using against them. So they're like, look, before we have a political revolution, we're having the social revolution. We need to change the way our society is organized, open up a little bit, have some free market sector. Otherwise, we're going to have a political revolution that overthrows the government. And unfortunately, that's what we saw in Chile in 1973. And hopefully, we don't get to that point with Cuba today. But it's just a matter of understanding economics and psychology and how the economists, the Chicago boys, the University of
Mm-hmm.
Chicago, Kissinger, they pioneered that, the shock doctrine, like that understanding of combining economics and psychoanalysis.
Yeah, exactly. That was in, from what I showed you, everybody just now, like back in 1973, that's what they said. But this is a strategy that they've been trying to do, like even before that, like when, back in like this blockade has been going on, since the 60s, right? And the U.S. empire is just it's running out of patience. It's seeing that these left wing candidates, after decades of them trying to topple them down and implant their puppets, the people in the global south have rose up time and time again and were able to successfully end the puppet regime that the US government had for a long time. And then they were able to have their left wing candidates, like in Honduras, what the people chose in Peru, Venezuela, in Syria, like all these countries. And now it's just that look at what they're doing in Cuba. They've ran out of patience, and they're trying to have these campaigns. And we even have idiots like the mayor of Miami saying that we should, have a military intervention.
Yeah. I think you want to mute. Yeah, I think you got muted for a second. Okay, I hear you now.
What part did I cut off?
The last thing you said was the mayor who wants military intervention.
Yeah, yeah. So they ran out of patience, so now they're talking about this stuff. And then another way that that the U.S. tries to manufacture people's consent is something that Ramiro mentioned earlier is trying to get celebrities to talk about this stuff to try to get some of the more apolitical people on board. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this, Ramiro. Here's an article talking about how there's local celebrities and artists that are reacting to the Cuban protests. There's Camila Cabello,
Mm.
Enrique Santos, Gloria Stefan made a came out with the hashtag SOS Cuba, saying the Cuban people are reaching their breaking point. I stand with them as I always have.
See, look at that fear, right? They're reaching their
Yeah,
breaking point. Like the second you read that, like you feel like you're anxious, right? So it's
it's
clever
the
word
language they
crafting.
use. I wouldn't be surprised if they get coaching from the same people,
Oh
since they're
yeah.
all probably a part of the same talent agencies. They're in the same email list. Willie Cherino, Los Peachy Boys, Pitbull.
Oh
Like, yeah,
god.
so you want to let people know a little bit about this?
Yeah, I mean, something that's interesting about the role of celebrities and Hollywood and propaganda is that going back to 1947, something that we've spoken about often with my boy Caleb. Shout out to Caleb. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, the U.S. CIA funding artists, funding creative people, and using them to oppose what they describe as totalitarian governments. 1947, this project of the CIA is created because again, 1947, what was happening around that time? You had the rise of media, especially television, by the 60s, right? The imperialists saw the power of media. They saw that at that time radio was more powerful, but television was becoming more popular, photography, print, and they saw the power in using media to create these figures, these strawmen who would eventually do the talking points and propaganda for them. Because it would be so much easier for the imperialist media to just put some army general or the head of Chase, Jamie Dimon, or these stockbrokers and be like, yeah, we want to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. We want to expand and maximize our profits. But they're not going to tell us that, right? They're going to have other
Mm-hmm.
people tell it for us. The people who they've groomed into celebrity and stardom, who they've appointed as the leaders of society, the people that everybody looks up to. And that's kind of what the role of Hollywood and all these things are, is like they build up these characters, they build up these artists, and they promote them and they control them so that they could get to a point where once they get a big enough following, they're like, okay, you're going to put out our talking points. You're going to say what we want you to say. And that's exactly what the Congress for Cultural Freedom did with promoting artists and musicians and having them promote this anti-communist message, because it would be less sexier if it was again the heads of the military industrial complex and the banks saying it, right, instead of some cool hipster artist who's like SOS Cuba, and so it's just really crazy. And in the US, we have to get out of one of the saddest things about politics in the US and the state of capitalism is that so many people get their politics from celebrities, and that's something that is so sad, honestly, because you talk to people around the world. I've been to, for example, Bangladesh. I've been to Haiti. I've been to Honduras. I lived in Ecuador for over a year. You talk to people in the global South, and people in the global South, a lot of time, not to say they're perfect, right, or they're free from celebrity worship, but I feel like compared to everywhere else in the world, the US people are so enamored and followed and brainwashed by celebrities. It's crazy. Like, we have to, who gives a fuck what Gloria Stefan has to say? Like, okay, she's Cuban, like, and she had a few hit singles like back in the day, but like, she's a millionaire. She has a mansion in Star Island in Miami. Like Pitbull, same thing, and it's like, why are we going to go to these people for our political and worldview? Something big like bombing Cuba, invading Cuba, like that's a huge life changing decision for the world. Why are we going to go to these people for advice on foreign policy. And so it's just crazy, man. I mean, it's something that really upsets me, and it just shows the need to revive other heroes. Like, I'm not going to idolize Pitbull and Gloria Estefan and all these people. I'm going to idolize like Fidel and Che and people, other revolutionaries. It's not bad to admire people, but it's like, who are you admiring, and why are we following what they think? And so, yeah, it seems like they all got the same talking points. It seems like a lot of them, the CAA, all these agencies that run Hollywood, they're all part of that whole imperialist apparatus. I would argue, and this sounds crazy, that Hollywood was created for the purpose of fortifying and expanding U.S. imperialism. We look at the 1910s and 20s with Universal Pictures, Columbia Pictures, Fox News, like all this stuff was created by really dark forces in the U.S. intelligence community and the military-industrial complex to promote American culture. Because imperialism is so much more than just economic and political, right? That's the main part of it. That's the base of the capitalist imperialist structure. But another big component of it is spiritual and cultural, because when you have U.S. media and television and propaganda, one of the things that's crazy is that, like, the U.S. imperialists, like, what they'll do is that they'll push for countries like China or other countries that have an independent model to run American TV shows, American products. They're selling American culture, and by default, capitalist culture. Coca-Cola, right? They did that in the Soviet Union. Kissinger, Reagan, they would have ads of like Pizza Hut and like blue jeans and people with Coca-Cola. You're not saying become a capitalist, support U.S. imperialism. They're saying, don't you want to try this nice Coca-Cola? Don't you want to wear these nice blue jeans and feel like an American? And they're doing that even in right-wing countries in Latin America. I'm sure if you go to Peru today, you have mega giants like Burger King, McDonald's, Chili's, all these fast food chains that are irrelevant in the U.S. but are setting up shop in Peru, that are displacing the women selling the ceviches, or the women selling the papas a la gallina. It's just like they're it's a cultural battle, and they're imposing. And so when people are fed this media propaganda of like American TV shows, American products, American music, then by default they're going to follow whatever those corporations or people do as well. It's part of it's like a grooming process that takes decades, and that's part of the culture war of U.S. imperialism.
It's really creepy stuff, man. It really is. Like the way that they try to gain people's trust with these celebrities, again, who they're all a part of the same, talent agency. Yeah. And I would refer people to this documentary series by Derek Bros, which you can find on theconsciousresistance.com or on Rockfin, that talks about Hollywood and its origin. Before that, movies were more independent. Like directors had more freedom to make the kind of movies that they want without like a studio telling them like how to make the movie. Or if there were studios, they were more independent. But now the military industrial complex, they overview, they have to give like the approval. The State Department also has to give the approval of scripts and the final cut of movies. It's really creepy stuff. So another thing, these celebrities are extremely out of touch. Like they live in a bubble. Like they have their own priorities. They don't know what the heck these working class people in Cuba want, and they're only going to do what some of their higher ups and some of the people who represent them tell them to say, like, and that what would be like good PR. And then these are the ones that get promoted more and they get more rich, as opposed to artists like Immortal Technique or R.A. the Rugged Man, or other artists out there that don't get promoted. In Chile, the artists that had positive messages that were anti-imperialist or for peace, they were killed by Pinochet and his regime. So I just wanted to mention that for people, like how creepy this is, and how they try to gain people's trust through these personalities that write songs that people really like and that you can hear all over the place or promoted all over the place because of the contracts that these music companies and contractors have with like the radio industry and all that.
Yeah.
Ramiro, I just wanted to ask you a bit, like, so we can talk a little bit more about debunk some of the things that people say about Fidel Castro, because we hear all this talk in the U.S. about how much of a horrible person he is, but here's an article here talking about how he was seen as a hero by many Africans, and he was admired by Nelson Mandela. So here's an article that talks about how a source of inspiration to all freedom-loving peoples. That's what Nelson Mandela called Cuban revolutionary leader, and with good reason. So you want to tell us a little bit more about how Fidel Castro helped some of the people in Africa fight against colonialism?
Yeah, Fidel Castro. I mean, he's somebody. Just to show you, I actually have a tattoo of Fidel right
Oh,
here.
snap.
I got it a few years ago. He's one of my personal heroes and icons, along with many other people. But you go anywhere in the world, and people love and respect Fidel Castro. It's only in the U.S. that, especially Miami specifically, that people are like, "Oh my God, Fidel's this evil dictator. He eats babies." But you go to anywhere in the world. I've in Bangladesh when I went. People, you will see Fidel and Che Guevara posters on the streets everywhere. You know, in Haiti, I saw Fidel Castro murals on the streets, and it's just like it's only in the U.S. that, and probably the EU as well to some degree, that we have this hatred for Fidel Castro. I mean, just some background on who he is, I think is really important. He's somebody who is a class traitor and even arguably a race traitor in the context of Cuba, in terms of him being somebody who comes from a more upper middle class white Cuban family that was well off. His family, I mean, they weren't like the ruling class, they weren't like the bourgeoisie in pre-revolutionary Cuba, but they had land, they had a small business, they had enough capital to survive and not give a fuck about anybody else. But Fidel was somebody who he became a lawyer. He studied Antonio Maceo, the Cuban revolutionary leader in the early 1930s, in the early part of the century. He studied a lot of figures early on in the 20th century, and he became inspired by the Soviet Union. He became inspired by Algeria. He became inspired by all the independence movements. Again, going back to what I mentioned early on, that the Cuban Revolution was an independence and national liberation movement because Cuba had been colonized by Spain up until 1898 and held as a neo-colony of the U.S. until 1959. So Fidel Castro, he is somebody who came from the white middle class in Cuba, betrayed his class and race interests, and joined the revolutionaries. He organized the Ortodoxo uprising in the 50s. Obviously, he took part in the Moncada rebellion in, I believe, 1956, 1954, 1956. Obviously organized and took part in the Cuban Revolution, led the Cuban Revolution. After coming to power, Fidel Castro understood that you need to internationalize the struggle. You need to build solidarity with people around the world, including the Soviet Union. And what's interesting about Fidel is that, in my opinion, he was one of the most principled communists throughout his life, who always wanted to maintain unity, because 2 years after the success of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, 2 years later, 1961, you had the Sino-Soviet split. You had the Soviet Union and China, the People's Republic of China, officially broke relations because in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev led the country in a more revisionist path, but you also had China, eventually led by the Gang of Four, moving in a more ultra-left path and a more Maoist path. And so Fidel Castro was like, look, we're all anti-imperialists here. We're all socialists. We want to defeat the empire. We need to stay together in order to survive. And so Cuba and the DPRK, North Korea, Kim Il-sung, led by Kim Il-sung, were one of the few countries in the socialist camp to be neutral in the Sino-Soviet split, to defend both China and the Soviet Union, because they understood the necessity of proletarian internationalism. Workers of the world unite against the capitalists and the imperialist empire. And Fidel Castro was somebody who practiced that into the 60s and the 70s. Into the 1960s, in the civil wars in Guatemala and in Colombia, he helped finance and train guerrilla fighters in Guatemala, the indigenous Maya, against the right-wing government that was imposed after after Jacobo Arbenz was removed in 1956, was actually one of the catapulting moments of solidarity for Che Guevara, who was living in Guatemala in 1956 during the coup against Jacobo Arbenz, orchestrated by the U.S. So Cuba sent arms, training, and funding to the indigenous Maya guerrillas in Guatemala, in Colombia as well. Then into the 70s in Nicaragua, obviously Fidel Castro helped support the Sandinista revolution. In El Salvador, the FMLN, the Frente Farabundo Martí de Liberación Nacional, another indigenous socialist movement in El Salvador. Fidel Castro helped that. You had also in 1970s, toward the middle of the decade in 1975, 74, the liberation war against the colonizers, the Portuguese, especially in Angola. You had the Cuban support for the Angolan MPLA, the movement for the liberation of Angola. You had Cuban troops, thousands of Cuban troops. I think over 7,000 Cuban troops died on the African continent, dying alongside their African sisters and brothers who they came from those countries. Interestingly enough, a lot of the Black Cubans who were in the guerrilla movement in Cuba were from those West African countries that they eventually died on and died in their homeland. So the Cuban, with the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias Cubanas, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba, and during the 70s, Cuba supported the liberation movements of Southern Africa, what is now today Angola and South Africa, helping to end apartheid, helping to support the African National Congress, supporting Zimbabwe, Mozambique, all those areas that were colonies of Portugal and colonized Europeans. They helped to liberate the Africans there. They also helped express solidarity with the Vietnamese people in the 70s as they were rebuilding from bombs, being one of the most heavily bombed countries by the US because of the Vietnam War, rebuilding their economy, building solidarity with the DPRK, building solidarity all over Latin America, the Caribbean, all over Asia. Fidel Castro was a true internationalist. He was somebody who didn't just care about Cuba. He didn't just care about his people. It's not like he had the revolution and was like, all right, we're good. That's it. No, he was an internationalist. He wasn't a narrow nationalist. He understood that in order to help lift and save his people, he loved his people, you have to unite with other people around the world who are fighting the same enemy. Because if there's imperialism anywhere in the world, eventually it's going to hit you and affect you. And that's what we're seeing today. Anytime, that's why it's important to show solidarity with Cuba and to stay alert, even in times when there's not much going on. And, Nicaragua has expressed solidarity with Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia. And so, yeah, Fidel Castro, man, in my opinion, he's like one of the GOATs. He is the man when it comes to socialism and communism. And I think he's going to go down as one of the most important figures in Latin American history.
Yeah, and I just want to end here on a positive note. All the good deeds that Fidel Castro did in helping other countries. Now there's other countries that are standing in solidarity with Cuba. Here we have Bolivians out in the street protesting for Cuba. There's other footage that you can find here from Kasukin News. They post a lot of videos of other countries that are on the ground. Yes, 2 days ago, I showed footage of Panamanians that were standing in solidarity with Cuba. Venezuela, like Ramiro said, and Nicaragua, Mexico, their leaders are standing in solidarity with Cuba and have made statements. And I wouldn't doubt if more countries come out in support of Cuba. If there's 184 countries that are against these economic blockades, then I can only imagine that more of them are going to be like, hey, this is effed up, and we're going to stand with Cuba. I just want to read some of these super rays before we head out here.
Cool.
There is Emblem Fate, or like Pasta likes to call you, Emblem Fate. You guys look like two revolutionary Latin boy band members. All jokes aside, love you guys. Keep it up. Stand against the imperialist. For sure. We will always stand against imperialism. Emblem Fate, another super ray. Thank you very much. I agree. Less don't work. Oh, I agree. Less don't hero worship for Oprah, Obama, The Rock. More respect towards Kwame Ture, Kwame Nkrumah, and Sankara. For sure, Mfate. I agree. Ramiro, any final words before we close off the stream here?
No, I just want to say, I mean, thanks again for having me on, man. It's always a pleasure talking with you and talking about anti-imperialism, socialism. I would say I just want to leave people with the understanding that this is what we've been preparing for this moment. All the discussions we've had about the synthetic left and color revolutions and imperial and bread tube and all and the CIA propaganda. It's happening now.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is it's not a game. It's not some weird call or interest that people have, because sometimes people view it that way, right? They're like, oh, like, why do you care about that stuff? Like, who cares? Like, that's just some conspiracy theorists or crazy whatever. But it's happening as we speak. Those spells that we've been breaking are being used, and the minds of millions of people are being warped by this spell that we have to go in and save the Cubans from this regime. And it's up to us to be like, yo, wake up. Like,
Yep.
you're under a spell. You're under a spell. Wake up. Like, do not fall for it. This is what we've been talking about. This is exactly what we've been talking about. No more wars. No, don't fall for the SOS bullshit. Don't fall for the Cubans are starving. You know, U.S. out. You know, so that we've been preparing for this moment. And I think as anti-imperialists, as independent journalists, as independent content creators, these are exactly the moments that are so important for us. And so I'm glad that we're having this conversation now. And you know, I'm going to be in Nicaragua this weekend. I'm shooting some more video. The theme of the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution this year in Nicaragua is defense with the Cuban Revolution. So I'm sure there's going to be tons of Cuban flags and people. The Cuban Revolution and the Sandinista Revolution are brother revolutions, and so I'm hoping to put out some content there. But in the meantime, subscribe to my channel, Ramiro Sebastian Funez. You can follow me there. And thanks again, man. It's always a pleasure being on your show.
Awesome, man. Yeah, thank you for being on. And I just want to let people know, if you ever find yourself siding with the U.S. empire when it comes to our foreign policy, you're on the wrong side, because just look at history. Look at history. They have their interests, like how we were just talking about here, of taking resources from these other countries, and these socialist countries that want to nationalize those resources are standing in their way. And like Ramiro said, we're here to try to wake you guys up, and big tech and all these other institutions that are part of the empire are trying to censor us. So now more than ever, support our work, share our videos as much as you can, support us on other platforms, and most importantly, stay informed. Ramiro, thank you again for
Thanks again, bro.
coming on.
No problem. Take care.